All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I was telling Eli that I felt right at home right away because you guys are playing 8-bit music as the welcome music this morning, and that is what we used to play at New York Tech Meetup between our demos. So I'm excited to be here this morning and talk to you all a little bit about community. And I'm going to see if my slides can get up on the screen. There we go. All right, so I already said hello, but I'm Jessica Quinn. I am currently the Managing Director of Civic Hall, which is a collaborative workspace and community and event center in New York City for people who are working on building technology for the public good. And prior to that, I was the Executive Director of New York Tech Meetup, which is the largest meetup group in the world. It now has over 52,000 members, mostly in New York City, all connected in some way to the technology community. And I'll get a little bit more into that in a minute. So when I think about community, I often think about the concept of tribes. And as Seth Godin says, people like us do things like this, that you find your people in the meetup phrasing, and you find those people who you can connect with and feel like you have something in common with. You all have come here because you are part of the PHP community and you have at least one thing in common. I thought I'd maybe start by seeing what other things you have in common. So I think as people, we like to make things fairly black and white, and so you may recognize this meme that came out a couple of years ago. How many of you are the person on the left-hand side of the screen? All right, we have lots of zero inbox people. How many of you are the person on the right-hand side of the screen? All right, I will never understand that as a left-hand side of the screen person. I have seen people come up and plug in their devices at New York Tech Meetup to do a demo and have like 97,000 unread emails, and it just makes me cringe and I can't handle it. Same kind of test, left-hand side, probably the same people that had zero inbox. Right-hand side? All right, more people are okay with having lots of alarms. So interestingly, in my personal life, I am the left-hand side, my husband is the right-hand side, and that sometimes causes conflict. And I didn't realize at first that that whole meme can actually be tied to this. Anybody recognize this? Myers-Briggs, you've probably seen it a lot. Sometimes it gets sort of thrown under the bus as not being very accurate. I personally find it somewhat helpful, at least in just having conversations with my husband. So the clean phone and the messy, disastrous phone relate to the J and the P in the Myers-Briggs setup. So one last little quiz. All right, how many people are on the left? Anybody on the right? Really? All right, so this has no relation to any personality typing whatsoever, but the people on the right are clearly wrong. What was that? Yeah, the people on the right are clearly wrong. All right, so future of community. I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey into community, a few lessons that I've learned, and then why I think our future is in community. So, you know, when we're kids, lots of people like to ask us that question, no matter almost how young you are, what do you think you want to be when you grow up? And if you were to ask me that question when I was 5 or 6 years old, I wouldn't have said, oh, I want to run the largest meetup group in the world, or I want to lead community and participate in membership organizations. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I wanted to be a dancer. Anybody else want to shout out what they wanted to be when they were 5 or 6 years old? Pro soccer player. Ninja, that's a good one. Anybody else? Astronaut, awesome. Mid-level manager, good answer, good answer. Well, and that one you can probably get to with some career planning. And you know, I'm a planner. I was on that left-hand side. I like to have an order to things and to map things out. I made a spreadsheet for our wedding. I had a spreadsheet before our daughter was born, tracking all of the things that we needed to get done. But when it comes to career, I really didn't do any career planning. I stumbled on all of the jobs that I ended up in. And as is sometimes nice, all of that lack of planning actually resulted in a career that makes some level of cohesive sense. But I didn't actually realize this until about a month ago. I was asked by our organizers and residents at Civic Hall to talk to them a little bit about my experience with community. And as we were sitting down talking, I was talking about my whole career history, and all of a sudden the light bulb went off, and I was like, oh, I've been working in and supporting membership organizations, communities of people connected around something specific, basically my entire career. And I never would have thought as a little girl, especially the one question I didn't ask when we were back on our Myers-Briggs is, how many I's are in the room? Introverts? How many extroverts? All right, and a lot of people that didn't want to raise their hands, so I'm going to assume you're introverts. I didn't think as an introvert that I'd want to be someone that was in charge of community and connecting people. I think people often conflate being an introvert with being a hermit, which in some cases can be true, but it's not always true. And I think all human beings need some sense of connectedness, even if you get that connectedness by being alone and connecting with other people through the internet, which is an awesome invention for introverts. All right, so I looked back on my life, though, and even though I was the introverted young kid, my love for community made a lot of sense. So this is the little village store in the town that I grew up in New Hampshire. It's been around for 250 years. And this is an old picture, but other than the road being better paved, it really does not look all that much different. And I think my sense of community came from growing up in this really small town where I saw all of the benefits of being connected to people around you and feeling like more people cared about me than just my parents and my family. And I clearly remember that I had one neighbor down the street who taught me how to tie my shoes, and another neighbor who, when I was struggling with fractions and trying to understand fractions, he used 4 quarters to teach me what a half of a half was. For whatever reason, I could not wrap my head around the idea that a half of a half was a quarter. But when he started using quarters to show me how to do that, and he took 2 quarters and said, what if I break them in half, and said, what do I have left? And I said, a quarter, all of a sudden the light bulb went off. And I realized that these are small, somewhat trivial examples, but there was something about that environment that made me feel safe, made me feel protected, made me feel like I was part of something important. And so when I think about community, I really think about how being with a group of people makes you feel. You know, there are lots of different containers for community. There are spaces, there are all the different places and organizations in which you can gather, but those containers are a little bit less important than how the community actually makes you feel. And for me, in my small town and a lot of the communities that I've belonged to and helped lead, the important feelings for me are that feeling of belonging, that feeling of being cared for, that feeling that you can trust the other people in your community, and that feeling of safety. And that all connects to our basic needs as human beings, that we need to feel safe, that we need to have our basic needs met, and that we really need to feel like we are connected to community and something bigger than ourselves. So my whole career, as I said, has actually ended up being about community. I started out doing fundraising for the Girl Scouts in Southern California, and then became the CEO of that Girl Scout organization, which at the time was about 75 staff and 15,000 girls and 5,000 volunteers. Then I moved on to New York Tech Meetup, which at the time seemed like a completely polar opposite community. I went from a 100-year-old organization that was pretty much 100% women to a brand new organization that was pretty much 100% men and focused on the tech community. But now I see that through line of community and connection and taking a lot of the concepts that I first learned at Girl Scouts and applying them to New York Tech Meetup and now to Civic Hall. So I thought I'd share a couple of lessons that I've learned along the way about building community. The first one is really around inclusion and exclusion. And I think one of the things that I learned at Girl Scouts was where there's a fine line sometimes between being exclusive to a point, meaning that you're creating that parameter around people like us do things like this so that you can define yourself as a community and have a connection point. But there's a fine line between that and then leaving people out and excluding people in a way that actually creates some negative community. So this is the Girl Scout promise and Girl Scout law. Anybody in the room Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts? Yes? All right. So you're familiar with some of these. So this is one of the things that often in communities we see, that there's some type of pledge, some type of something that you identify with where you say, yes, I am part of this community. Eli talked about a code of conduct. There's a code of conduct here. If you're here, you're basically saying, all right, I'll abide by that code of conduct. And that's really, really important to have those parameters. I was looking at this morning, and I think you can see the word God in the Girl Scout promise. Now, at some point, they added an asterisk next to the word God, which was a bit controversial at the time. I don't know why there's no asterisk there anymore. I will have to investigate this. But the addition of the word asterisk next to the word God was basically to say, yes, we want to have a promise. We want to have something that we as a group connect to and share, and we want to have collective and shared values, but we don't want to be so exclusionary that we're only going to accept people who believe in God. And so they put the asterisk next to God so that if you had a different God that you worshiped, or if you didn't worship a God at all, that you wouldn't feel like you were being left out of the organization. And so to me, you know, this scene from Mean Girls, where, you know, it's like, you can't sit with us, you can't be with us at the cafeteria. There are ways in which those guidelines and parameters of our community often actually get in the way of us creating a positive community space. And I think it's incredibly important that we welcome newcomers into a space, that we create little doors for people to come in, even if we do have those strong parameters. So at New York Tech Meetup, one of my experiences with this, so we were well known for doing live demo events every single month in New York City. We would have 7 to 10 different tech startups do live demos on stage, no PowerPoint, and we had a couple of rules. And one of the rules was that the audience could ask questions, but there was one question that they couldn't ask. And that question was, what's your business model? And the reason behind not allowing people to ask that question was that we wanted them to stay focused on the technology. We felt that, and this was predating me, it was something that the founders had incorporated, and the founder, Scott Heiferman, felt like we should be focused on the tech, that the business model question was kind of boring, and that the tech was much more interesting than talking about the business model. And so when I took over running New York Tech Meetup, we continued to have that rule. And one day, somebody in the audience asked, what's your business model? And in this theater of 850 people, the audience let out this loud boo. And I found out later that the guy who had asked the question had no idea that he wasn't supposed to ask it. And he was really, really upset that 850 people had just booed at him. So talk about feeling excluded from a community. And he sent me a really kind of not so nice note about how if we were trying to be this inclusive, welcoming community for people in the tech industry, how could we have it set up so that this newcomer would arrive and get booed by 850 people? And so I actually asked him out to coffee and sat down and explained the rule to him and why we did it. And he totally understood, but he asked me to please put a warning at the beginning of each meetup that you weren't allowed to ask that question. And so now, at the beginning of every monthly meetup, Andy, the organizer who took over for me, we still say at the very beginning, the one question you're not allowed to ask is, what's your business model? And I'll warn people that if they ask it, they might get booed. And it's helped a lot, because people then don't feel like they're being caught off guard by these unsaid, unwritten community rules that they didn't know anything about when they walked in the door. And so I think one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is that if you're going to have those rules, if you're going to have those guidelines about what makes you in or what makes you out of a particular community, that you have to be somewhat transparent about those guidelines. Our other rule at New York Tech Meetup was around not showing PowerPoint. So we were very explicit with people at the beginning that you had to do a live demo, that you couldn't do a PowerPoint presentation. The other thing was that we expected people to get right to the demo. We didn't want them to spend a lot of time just chatting, because that was basically the same as doing a PowerPoint presentation. And Scott Heiferman, the founder, was famous for sitting in the audience and yelling, "Get to the demo," if people were chatting for too long. And again, demoers that were not prepared that he might do that got really upset that they got yelled at from the audience while they were trying to do their demo on stage. And so we prepared them and said, look, if you talk too long at the beginning, you might get yelled at. And so it's not that you have to change your rules or not have any rules, it's just share your rules so that other people can come into the community and join you. And I think that the other component of that is that if you end up with a community of people who are all exactly the same and you don't ever let new people in or talk to people outside of your community, you can end up with an echo chamber. And I think we've seen this a lot in the last year in political conversations where one side has no idea what the other side is thinking or what their perspective is. And that people get caught off guard often because they're in such an echo chamber and they only hear one side of things. And so I think even though there is a lot that comes from being connected and being the same and finding those similarities with each other, there's also really good things that happen from seeing those differences. And when I talked at the beginning about my husband and I being totally different in terms of how our phones look, I actually think that that's a really, really good thing. It means that I push him to be a little bit more organized and a little bit more on time, and he pushes me to be a little bit more spontaneous and to be a little bit less structured. And I think that that's a really good combination, and that diversity is what makes our communities really strong when we do have people who push back and question things and create more dialogue. So the next lesson that I learned was really about the power of the combination of online and offline. I don't know about many of you, but as an introvert, I was really, really happy when I started to be able to do things online that I used to have to do by calling someone, like calling the credit card company or calling to make a reservation. There was something about phone calls that I used to have a lot of anxiety about. And so when I got to go online and type in and not have to call and talk to another human being to get things done, that was really, really exciting for me. But I also have realized that, my life would not feel as whole and complete if I didn't have those offline connections as well. And so this was something that I really learned at New York Tech Meetup and through Meetup and the philosophy of Meetup in general. So I don't know how many of you know the background of Meetup.com, but Scott Heiferman founded Meetup.com really in a reaction to 9/11. So he noticed that after 9/11 in New York, lots of people wanted to connect with each other. But we didn't really have an efficient way of doing that people were sometimes, posting index cards up in the lobbies of their apartment buildings, or they were trying to find each other on really basic listservs. But there was no real way of putting up your hand and saying, hey, I'm interested in kayaking, or I'm interested in PHP, and letting other people who are interested in the same thing find you. And Scott thought it was incredibly interesting and not a great thing that we lived in this big city on top of each other, and yet we couldn't find each other. And so that's really where Meetup was born, and the idea of Meetup in the beginning was to create a space online to help people meet each other offline. And I think for as much as I love the online space, and sometimes, especially in the past, used to avoid the offline space, I've really seen how the combination of the two adds up to something wonderful. So just as with a lot of the software that we saw demoed on our stage at New York Tech Meetup, we saw the magic that happens when lines of code are put together and create something amazing. And one of our most popular and I would say sort of legendary demos was actually, I saw Twilio's logo on here, John Britton from Twilio live coding on stage at New York Tech Meetup and just kind of set the bar for doing a live demo. And there was something about the magic in that was truly amazing. But there was also something about the magic of the people sitting in the audience. And I've since learned in collecting stories from people who came to New York Tech Meetup that they've gone on to, someone that they met in our audience, they've gone on to marry that person, that they've gone on to found a company with that person, they've hired someone that they met in that audience. And so I think there's this power of connection that is really enhanced when you combine both online and offline together. And one other personal example of this, so this is a screenshot of the Slack channels for my parents group. I'm happy to have a parents group that is technologically savvy and upgraded from using a Yahoo group to using Slack as our method of communication. And I think, you know, one of the things about this group is that, and I put this up here in part because there are some very funny channels. You'll notice the channel in the middle that is mostly for the moms in the group. But you know, this to me is a perfect example of this online-offline combination that I'm talking about, because all of us live in the same neighborhood in New York City. We all live in Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Brooklyn. We all have kids who were born between November 2015 and February 2016. So we're all actually geographically really, really close to each other. So we can see each other frequently, and we do. But you can't necessarily reach out and ask someone or go visit your neighbor at midnight when you have a question about feeding or you have a question about sleeping, and you want to try to get a quick answer. And it turns out that new parents are up at all hours of the night. And so interestingly, this has served as a place, it's like a 24-hour hotline practically for peer support and parenting questions. And so we don't have to wait until our weekly meetup at the beer garden to ask each other about these things. We build community 24/7 through asking questions and posting answers in this group. And to me, that's what it has enhanced our offline connection. We feel like we know each other better when we see each other in person. And when we see each other in person, that enhances then our sense of being connected to people that we see in this online space. And this group to me also exhibits a lot of the things that I was talking about. There are group norms, there are ways that we talk and behave, there are parameters around how you join the group, but we're also really, really welcoming to new people. And that leads to the last lesson that I wanted to share, which is that culture happens. And I think, you know, the biggest lesson that I've learned, whether it's running one of the communities that I've been a part of or running an organization, is that whether you mean for it to or not, whether you're thoughtful about it or not, there is some type of culture that develops in every group and every organization. So interestingly, in the parents group that I'm in, often what happens is we have new people who join, and they're used to being in moms-only groups. And so they address the group as, hi moms, or hi mommies. And interestingly, we've developed a sense that we are a parents group. There are a lot more women in the group than there are men, but we want the men to feel welcome. So inevitably, one of the admins or somebody else in the group will step into that person who said, hi moms or hi mommies, and say, you know, welcome, we're so glad to have you here. Because we have dads in this group too, we tend to not refer to people as moms or mommies, we say parents. And it sets that norm and that tone for the group. And that is something that has stuck with this group since it started a couple of years ago. And I think, you know, what I see in a lot of groups and a lot of organizations is that The issue with culture isn't so much about the fact that you're not outlining what your expectations are, or what your values are. We've all seen tons of companies that have really nice values statements, really nice posters about their values up on the wall, but then in what they actually do, you don't see the values exhibited at all. And so I think one of the most important things about building a strong community is understanding that you need to be thoughtful about building the culture and also thoughtful about aligning what you do with what you say. And that really when people feel like a culture isn't good, a lot of times it has to do with the fact that you've said one thing and that you're doing something else, that you're not living the values or the culture or the code of conduct that you set out to live. And that communities really thrive more when what you say and what you do are in alignment. And like I was saying about Seth Godin earlier in this concept of tribes, this idea that people like us do things like this. So in a community, defining what it is that you will do and won't do. And like I was saying about New York Tech Meetup, there's nothing wrong with or against or for or against showing PowerPoint presentations. There's nothing inherently wrong about asking about business models. It was just that we decided as a community that that wasn't what we did. And I think that as a community, it's really important to define those things, what you will do and what you won't do, what you will stand for and what you won't stand for. And like I said about the moms group, we at least internally when we're talking in the group, we don't call it a moms group, it's a parents group. And we set that norm and we set that tone. The other thing, how many of you are parents in the room? All right, lots of parents. So you know that the world of parenting, and I would say in particular motherhood, but parenting in general can be a very contentious space. That you've got people who believe in breastfeeding only, and you've got people who believe in formula feeding, and you've got people who believe in elimination communication. How many of you know what that is? So people who believe that you should never have your child in diapers, that from a very young age, you should run your child to the toilet when they look like they need to go to the bathroom, and that is the only proper way to care for a child. Other people that are cloth diaper people, and then you've got the disposable diaper people. It can be a very contentious space. And you can imagine that in a community of parents whose main connection is that they live in the same geographic area and they have kids around the same age, how do you get a group of people like that to all get along? Well, part of it was that we set the norm very early on by the way that we interacted with each other, that we weren't going to judge about those individual choices. That everyone makes their own choice around what's good for them, what fits with their values, and it wasn't up to us to judge that. And so we were able to build this really amazing community that feels incredibly supportive and welcoming, and where everybody feels like they belong because no one is getting judged about their individual choices. So, why do I think that the future is community? And I would say that our past has been about community. If you look back to the earliest days of human beings, we've always been about banding together to get things done or to simply survive. But I think community is even more important right now because we are in a time where a lot of people feel very, very uncertain about what our future holds. And when we have an increase in uncertainty, we also have an increase in fear. And when we start being afraid, we need something to counteract that. And one of the things to counteract that is community. And we can turn to community for very silly things to make us feel connected. Many of you have probably seen this video. This is a still shot from a video about a guy who, on the right, is dancing like crazy at a festival by himself for a while, and then another guy joins, so he is no longer alone. He is now at least in fellowship with one other person. And then lots of people start joining, and all of a sudden he's got this community of dancers so that he's no longer alone. And then we also need community for the really important, really serious things. The things that are at the core of who we are as human beings and what matters to us in our world. And I think as we become more and more connected to machines, as machines become more part of us, as our world becomes more and more digital, it's it's really important for us to not lose that human connection, that human connection, the sense of empathy, the sense of connectedness, is something that is incredibly, incredibly important for us to embrace even more as we move forward in our digital world, and that we need to be not less human, not more machine-like, but more human. And as Margaret Mead says in this famous quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so as you go about your conference and are here connecting with each other, I just want to say that it's amazing that you are here in community with each other, and to carry that spirit of connectedness and commitment and mutual support forward into the rest of the sessions that you do during this conference. Thank you.